Good afternoon. It's time to begin our regular Halacha shir. The topic that I want to speak about today, the topic I want to focus on, is ritual Netilat Yadaim. The subject divides into many subcategories. Today, I want to set aside and not talk about the question of Netilat Yadayim for Ruach Ra, for purely spiritual matters. I also want to set aside and not talk about Netilat Yadayim for eating foods, fruits and vegetables, which are wet. That's also an important topic, which we're not going to talk about today. The topic which I do have in mind is Netilas Yadayim before eating bread. And before we come to the details of how many times to pour the water, how much water, and what to do if you're hiking or camping and don't have a lot of water, before we come to the details, let me ask you if you have any questions of a halachic nature that you wish to discuss first. Nothing from down under. Okay.
For whatever you want.
Okay, let's talk about Netilas Yadayim then. I go again with getting it on the screen. Voila, I think I did it. Okay. The story begins with a passage in the Yerushalmi. And of course, I don't bother saying exactly where I draw the sources from, because you always have the chapter number, page number, paragraph number on the screen if you want to check out my typographical errors and check out the context. As you know, I'm not a great typist. We are taught in the Yerushalmi, Mayim Rishonim, the water that you pour on your hands at first before eating bread. That's Mayim Rishonim, Notel Umafsik. You pour the water, stop, pour again, stop. Well, we don't know how many times. We have to stop between pours, between pouring on the hands. B'shniyim, the water that you pour on your hands after eating bread, at the end of the meal, before Birkat Hamazon, Eino Mafsik. You don't have to pause, just one pour is enough. Now, Yerushalmi, this is so typical of the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi is so difficult for us to understand. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, the Yerushalmi is older than the Bavli, and the editing of the Yerushalmi is extraordinarily concise, and all the information is packed together, and then Yerushalmi over and over again almost always just assumes that you know what it's talking about, and therefore it's fairly difficult to understand compared to the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which is edited much later, and although it has its difficulties, and there are plenty of difficulties in understanding the Bavli, relatively speaking, it reads a lot easier, and you can get a lot, maybe not all, but you can surely get a lot of the meaning of the Bavli just by reading it. Yerushalmi, to get very, very little out of it just by reading it. Well, let's see what the commentaries have to say about this particular passage. We begin with the Ravid. He was from Provence, southern France, 12th century. And he says, what the Gemara means, what the Yerushalmi means is, shofech pam achat umafsik. You pour the water once and stop. Achakach shofech pam shniya. And then you pour a second time on the hands. The second pouring of the water, kedei lehater et hamayim rishonim. The first pouring of the water goes onto your hands and your hands make the first water impure. Now you need a second pouring of the water to wash off the first water. That's why you need two. The first pour purifies the hands, but the water gets tameh, gets impure. Second pouring washes off the impure water. And in the Mishnah, there's a proof for this. The first pour purifies the hands. The second pour is not to purify the hands. The second pour is to purify the water, to wash the water off that was left on the hands. Now let's think about it for a moment. According to Ravid, and we're going to see in a moment that this is the mainstream opinion. According to the Ravid, two pours are required. One, two, that's all that's required. And the second pour really has nothing to do with the hands. The second pour has only to do with the water that is left over from the first pour. Now imagine a very simple situation. What happens if you pour only once and then let your hands dry in the air? No water on your hands anymore. So the whole purpose of the second pour has evaporated, quite literally evaporated. Well, if you just hold your hands in the air until they dry, according to the Ravid, one pour is all that is needed. More commonly, if someone would do one pour and then dry the hands on a towel, if the hands are in fact dry, there is no water left from the first pour, and there's nothing to wash off in the second pour. You don't need a second pour. Bottom line, the Ravid requires two pours, the second one being needed only to rinse off the water left from the first pour. If there is no water left from the first pour, either it evaporated in the air or you dried it on a towel, if the fact is that there's no water on your hands after the first pour, then one is sufficient. That's the position of the Ravid.
I have a
Well,
question.
sure.
When it says ve'eno mafsik, it's talking about in between like one hand to the other or in between pourings.
One on each hand, on one hand. We're talking here about one hand at a time.
Right, so you're saying the mimer showing him the first pouring, you
On one
pour.
hand, on the left hand, typically right-handed people hold the kos, hold the natla in the right hand. So the first pour is on the left hand. Stop, then do a second pour. You can't just have it continually flowing. In order to wash off the first water, you need a pause.
Uh, and then the second one, there is no pause. When he says ve'eno mafsik, what is obviously there's a pause because you're stopping, but you
No, no,
stop.
no. Then after the second pour, even though your hands are wet, you can go eat bread.
Oh yeah, that's what eno mafsik means?
Yep.
Hmm.
You don't have to wait. No waiting required. There is a waiting required between the first and the second pour, but no waiting required between the second pour and hamotzi.
Okay.
Now, let me just point out that this is, of course, halacha. As far as derech hilchot derech eretz, as far as midat hasidut is concerned, as far as tzniut is concerned, which is, of course, quite important, one should not eat bread with wet hands. Doesn't matter why the hands are wet. One should not eat bread with wet hands. That's an Indian of hasidut, not an Indian of halacha.
Hmm.
Um, uh, the truth is, there are tons of issues where Hasidut demands of us behavior above and beyond what halacha requires. There are tons of examples of that. And the truth is, I do not know which is more important, halacha or Hasidut. I know that both are terribly important. After all, if you don't conform to the halacha, you're not performing the mitzvahs, and what could be worse than that? On the other hand, if you're not conforming to Hasidut, then you're in violation of Hatznea Lechet, Malachi Hanavi said, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from you? Hatznei aleches, to live in a modest way, which is not exactly a halachic requirement. Um, uh, I'll give you one example, and you'll understand the vast gulf, the vast gap between halacha and Hasidus. As far as halacha is concerned, there is no particular prohibition of nudity. Someone who was not wearing any clothes at all is in violation of nothing. Well, if this person performs the mitzvahs of the Torah, so you merit a place in Olam Haba. Wearing clothes, beginning to end, is entirely a matter of Hasidus, a matter of tzniut, which is something separate from halacha. Now, it's terribly important. The halacha is terribly important. Which is more important? I'm not willing to say. I don't know which is more important. And what I said is, there's one exception to what I said. The Mishnah, the Rambam, the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch, and as far as I know, all the poskim agree with what it says in the Mishnah, in the Rambam, in the Tur, and the Shulchan Aruch, namely, someone who has no clothing on at all and is, for example, kneading dough to make bread with, when it comes time to recite the bracha for the mitzvah of taking challah min ha'isa, separating challah from the dough, there are minimum requirements of dress, namely covering the genitals. And in tefillah, as the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Tzadi, tefillah, for Kriya Shema, it's enough minimal dress. For tefillah, lo yitpalel ad sheyechaseh et libo. For tefillah, you need also a torso to be covered. Now, of course, these are the rock bottom minimum requirements of halacha, and someone who conforms to them is guilty of nothing. And if you perform mitzvahs, so you merit chelik in olam haba. But the requirements of Hasidus, the demands of modesty, require a lot more. So, in any event, we understand the shita of we understand the way the Ravid understands the Gemara, namely, 2 pores on each hand. The second one is to wash off the water from the first one. If there is no water left from the first one, either because it evaporated or you dried it on a towel, 1 pore of water is sufficient. But we're not talking yet about the amounts. We're going to come to the quantities a little bit later. Rashi agrees with this. Well, this is a little bit anachronistic since Ravid was in the 12th century and Rashi was in the 11th century, around 80 years between them. But Rashi says, Tanan b'Maseches Yadaim, we learn in the Mishnah, shetzarich litein mayim al yadav shnei pa'amim. 2 pores are required. The first, purify the hands. The first pour purifies the hands. The second one purifies the water which is wet on the hands, because that water became impure from the hands. Rashi and Ravid are in agreement. It's not only them. The Tosafot says the same thing. Also relying on the Mishnah, tzarich lishpoch mayim al yadav shalosh pa'amim. It's not exactly the same thing. We have a third pouring of the water in the Tosafot. The first time, laha'avir tit, medavar chotzitz me'al yadav. The additional pouring, he requires 3. The additional one is the first one, which he's added. That just washes the hand from dirt. Your hands have to be clean. before you do Netilas Yadaim, because in order to purify the hands, like going into the mikveh, we cannot have any chatzitza, anything interrupting between the flesh and the water, and therefore the first pour cleans the hands from any dirt which happens to be on the hands. The second pouring is what purifies the hands, because now there's no interruption between the water and the hands. And the third time is to get rid of the water, which was from the second time. So in concept, well, in fact, Tosafos agrees with all the previous sources. You really need only two, if you begin with clean hands. And someone once taught me you're supposed to wash your hands with soap and water before you eat anyway. If your hands are clean, then two pours are sufficient. The only purpose of the first pour is to wash the hands, to clean the hands if they're dirty. And the other two pours are exactly the way the other commentaries understand them. For one, makes the hands pure. Number two, the next one washes off, rinses off the impure water. And therefore, they all agree that if your hands are clean, no dirt on them, so the first pour is not necessary. If after pouring water on your hands, they then are dry, either from evaporation or using a towel, then you don't need the third pour. You don't need the last pour because there's nothing to rinse off. So basically, they're all agreed. Um, let's see how this plays out in the thinking of other poskim. Chazon Ish, the great authority of Bnei Brak, one of the greatest of the modern Rabbanim, famed, quite justifiably famed, for his chumrot, for his strict positions. Nireh, it seems to me, and as we've seen over and over again, the rabbis expressed themselves modestly, it seems to me, but he's not hedging his position. No one told him he had to publish this. The very fact that he did publish it means that he's firmly committed to this opinion. Let me mention in passing that this is from the first volume of the Chazon Ish. This volume was published in Europe before he came to live in Eretz Israel. And this first volume, when it was published in Europe, was published anonymously. The Chazon Ish was a totally unknown figure in Europe. He learned in some tiny little Beis Midrash in Vilna that few people had ever even heard of it. No one knew it existed even. And when he finished writing the first volume of the Chazon Ish, he brought it to Reb Chaim Grudzinski, who was the chief rabbi of Vilna, to show it to him. And Reb Chaim Ozer, he thought this was the greatest sefer he had ever seen, and only he knew who the author was. Later, the cat was let out of the bag. This whole story about how people found out who the author was, and the subsequent volumes were published with his name on it. But Chazon Ish is, of course, not his name. His name was Yeshayahu Karelitz, and there's a remez to his name in the title. Actually, I wrote Chazon Ish, which is the way most people write it, but he himself did not write Chazon Ish. He wrote Merchaot, Aleph Yud, then Merchaot before the Shin, because it's not really his name. In any event, this is what the Chazon Ish said. Kevan delo gazru ela mishum de askonios. The only reason we have to wash hands before eating bread or in the morning when you wake up, the only reason is because hands are askani, hands to do all kinds of things. For example, when you wake up in the morning, there's no way to know whether or not your hands, while you were sleeping, there's no way to know whether your hands touched a part of the body which is normally covered. If the hands touch a part of the body which is normally covered, then you require Netilas Yadaim before doing anything of a Kedusha nature, brachas, tefillah, Kriya Shema, and so forth. That's why you have to wash hands in the morning when you wake up. We're going to deal with Ruach Ra, not today, another time. And similarly, when you come to eat, there's no your hands. We're doing a lot of things before you come to eat. You have to wash them first. Ra'ui lomar damayim mitaharim et hayad ve'en b'koach hayad l'tomosam. Well, how on earth is it possible for the hands to make the water impure? Ella, he says, Makom Makom, Kevan She'ena Rishonim Gomrim L'Taher. The reason you need the second pouring is because the first pour does not complete the job of purifying the hands. It's not like we understood earlier today, that you have to rinse off the impure water with the second pouring. Rather, the job of purifying the hands was not accomplished, was not totally finished with the first pour. You need the second pour. And mitamim ad sheyavo shniyim aba'im l'taher et hayad v'yimtzu rishonim al gabe yad yishtatfu al l'taher. You need the second pouring to complete the process of purifying the hands, according to the Chazon Ish, and this is not the only situation in which he is among the strictest of poskim. The second pouring of the water is not only to rinse off the first water, and therefore, if there is no first water left on your hands, you could skip the second pouring. According to the Chazon Ish, the second pouring is absolutely required. It doesn't matter whether your hands were dried after the first pouring, you still need the second pouring. Az yitaharu gam rishonim al gabe yad. In order to purify the hands properly, you need two pourings. Have hayad ke'en shnei devarim mitarim otam. There are two steps in the process of purifying the hands. Hamitahar rishon iklash tuma. The first pouring weakens the impurity, but doesn't remove it entirely. The gamma mayim shalayad, with the remaining water on your hand, urav bem koach tahara. Well, after you've poured one time, you have a mixture of halfway, a mixture of pure and impure. You absolutely need the second pouring. Now at this point, someone who before eating bread does a single pour on one hand, a single pour on the other hand, can I smile on that procedure, or shall I rebuke that person, assuming that I have reasonable expectation that the person will accept my rebuke, assuming that I have reasonable expectation that the person who wants to learn the correct way to do things and wants to be instructed? Should I rebuke that person and say, no, two pourings, two pourings? Well, of course, there's no reason to correct someone who is following any of the great poskim, especially in this case, where you're following the mainstream of poskim. As long as your hands are clean to begin with, and therefore the water touches the skin all over the hands, people who are washing once, fine. There's no prohibition in then proceeding to eat the bread. All is well. What about people who are makpid, very strict to wash twice? Shall I mock them? Shall I be unhappy with them for being unnecessarily strict and wasting water? Reb Shmuel, we're going to see later today that the poskim recommends using a lot of water. We're going to talk about how much the shiurim are later, but it's recommended by the poskim to use a lot of water. Once Reb Shmuel Salant, the founder of the Musar movement, was invited for a meal in someone's house, and he poured just absolutely the minimum amount of water on each hand. And the Balabayas who had invited Reb Shmuel Salant for the meal saw how he's so careful to just pour the minimum amount of water on each hand and asked the great rabbi, don't all the poskim agree that ribui mayim, more water is better? Why do you minimize the amount of water you use? To which he said, well, the maid is the woman who you send to the river a few times a day to bring buckets of water into the house. If I use more water than necessary, I'm just placing an unnecessary burden on the maid, and there's no reason for me to make her life more difficult. Ah, well, of course, this was in those days. Now they have these things where you can just turn the valve and the water just comes pouring out, rather like the Bedouin sheikh who was meeting with Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. Is customary in Bedouin society when one has a guest, the host asks the guest, "What from my house can I give you as a gift?" What is it that you would want? So Ben Gurion knew the customs of the Bedouins, and when he was hosting the sheikh of the Bedouins, he knew to ask, "What can I give you from my house as a gift?" And the Bedouin sheikh said, "Well, what I would want is that valve you've got where you just turn it and have water. You don't have to fetch it from the river or the well." Well, it took a long time, but eventually they got their valves also. So in any event, basically one pour, unless your hands are dirty, then you have to clean them first. And the second pour is necessary if there's still water on your hands after the first pour, if it didn't evaporate or wasn't dried with a towel. So far, only the Chazon Ish requires the second pour. Now let's talk about the Rav Mishantz. He was back from the days of the Balei Tosfos, and this is what he says. Rishon the Mushnim, the water that you wash your hands with before eating bread, and the water afterwards, after eating, before Birkat HaMazon, Kule Mechiltin Mishum, Kishenatol Yadav B'shtifa Achas Ad HaPerek. All the sources agree that if you wash the hands only once, Ad HaPerek, up to the joint, Perek is the joint, up to the joint. If you wash your hands up to the joint, Af al pi sheyadav taharos la'achar sheyishafshef b'kotel uvamapa. Really, he points out, purifying the hands can be a much simpler procedure, not using water at all. If you rub your hands against the wall, or rub your hands on a cloth dry, rubbing your hands on the wall or on a dry cloth, min hadin, that is sufficient to purify the hands. Nonetheless, im chazav naga b'mei hashifshuf tamim, but if subsequently your hands get wet, then they're going to be tummy again. That's why we do 2 pours of water on each hand, so that they will not subsequently become tummy again. According to this, it is similarly like all the other sources, sufficient with 2 pours, and the second pour can even be dropped if your hands are not going to be in contact with any water after the first pour. Now we come to the more common opinions, which are strict. The Mishnah Brura, as you know, is divided into 3 sections. There's the Mishnah Brura, which has just brief, succinct statement of halacha, do this, don't do that. And on certain issues, he goes into more depth. That's the biur halacha, printed in certain halachot. And at the bottom of the page, he has his tziyun, Shar Tziyun is sources, and occasionally, in addition to sources, occasionally has extra notes in the Shar Tziyun as well. In any event, in the Bir Halacha, where he goes into a little bit more depth, he writes as follows. He mentions the opinion of the Rosh Mishans that we just looked at. And then he says, Pashut, it's obvious. The after Iker Hanhaga Shalmayim Shniyim, Rak Mishabachshashzeh, even though it's clear and obvious that the second pouring of the water is only to wash off, only to rinse off the first water left from the first rinsing, from the first pour, Im kvar nagav, nigev, yado, and therefore, if you dried your hands with a towel after the first pour, medina, therefore the halacha does not require a second pour, even though this is all perfectly obvious, and we saw all the sources, except the Chazon Ish, which stated this. But kevan shehinhigu hachamim mayim shni, since the rabbis talk over and over again about the second pour on each hand, and yachol liftor atzmo lechatchila al yedei niguv, lechatchila, you should definitely do the second pour. Lechatchila, you should not rely upon your hands drying in the air or drying them on a towel after a single pour. Lechatchila, you should do exactly what the sources say. They all talk about a second pouring, and therefore that's what you should do. This is a motif. This is an idea which repeats it, which the Mishnah Berurah returns to over and over again. When Chazal say do it this way or do it that way, or even when the Rishonim say do it this way or do it that way, lechatchila, one should do it exactly as they say, even though parts of what they say might not actually be required, as the poskim explain. And therefore, someone who does only one pour, according to the Mishnah Berurah, that person should be rebuked. And that person should be told, no, no, no. Chazal and the poskim all talk about a second pour. Therefore, you should do. On the other hand, someone who is unlikely to accept my rebuke, someone who is unlikely to listen to what I have to say, it's better to remain silent rather than tell people things they're not going to do anyway. Now the question arises, can I offer that person a piece of bread? Someone who did a single pour, well, even the Mishnah Berurah, who insists on the second pour, agrees that it's only lechatchila, and therefore, b'diavad, if someone did a single pour, b'diavad, that makes the hands pure. And if I make the bracha hamotzi and I cut the bread, there's no objection to me offering a piece of bread to the person who only washed once. Okay. Up to this point, we've been talking about the number of pours. Bottom line, one pour is sufficient if the hands are clean to begin with, and if the hands will be dried afterwards. Two pourings is required if the hands are not going to be dried after the first pouring. If the hands are not clean, then you're going to need an additional pouring of the water first to clean the hands. That's what we have up till now. Now we're going to talk about the quantity of water. This is the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, Im shafach al shtei yadav revius b'pam achat. If you took a revius of water, a revius is a poskim disagree about how much a revius is, or what do the poskim not disagree about. The most common opinion, the most widely accepted opinion, is that a revius of water is 86 cubic centimeters. 86, which is a standard size drinking cup. Is usually around 200, so half of that is 100. A little bit less than that is 86 cubic centimeters. And since we're talking about water, measuring weight and measuring volume is the same, because Well, because that's that's how one measures density with water at room temperature and standard pressure. 86, 86 cubic centimeters, 86 grams will give you the same amount of water. That amount of water is good for both hands. Kevan de'ein sham mayim tmeim klal. If one washes the hands with a revius, then the water left on the hands is going to be tahor, is going to be pure. All this business of washing off the first water had to do with people who use less than a revius of in order to wash their hands. Now, the standard size natla, the standard size cups that people use for washing their hands are many times more than a revius. And therefore, nowadays, when we have so much water just pouring out of the berries, you don't have to fetch it every time you want it from the river or the well. And nowadays, just about everyone is pouring much more than a revius of water every time they pour. If you use a revius or more, a single pour of a single revius, you're done, according to the Shulchan Aruch. All this business of the second pour to rinse off the water from the first pour, that was talking only about using a small amount of water. Similarly, Similarly, if you don't wash your hands at all with Netilas Yadaim, if instead you immerse your hands into the mikveh, it's another way to purify your hands. Tevila, immersing your hands into the mikveh, well, that's at least as good, even better, than a revius of water. That's all you have to do. One dunk into the mikveh, or if you're having a picnic at the at oceanside, at lakeside, one dip of the hands into the ocean or into the lake, which is a kosher mikveh. That's all you need. And if you're going to do that because you're having a picnic at the side of the lake or whatever, the correct bracha would be Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvotav, Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al tevilat yadayim, because you're not doing netila at all, you're doing immersion in a mikveh or in the lake. A single immersion in the mikveh or a single immersion in the lake or ocean, that's sufficient, just like a single pour is sufficient according to all the poskim if you use a revius of water or more. The Ramah adds, the Ashkenaz posuk adds, Yeshavim, de'im shofech al yadav shalosh pa'amim, eino tzarich lizaher b'chol zeh. If you are using a small amount of water, small means less than a revius, which is unusual nowadays. 3 pours will always be okay. V'chein nahagu lahakel, in Ashkenaz territory, the common minhag, the common practice is always to pour 3 times so as not to have to worry about whether you have a revius or not. Back when he wrote this, of course, water was a very precious commodity. It had to be carried from the well or drawn from the well or the river or wherever, and people absolutely minimized the amount of water that they would use. As far as the water left after the first pour is concerned, the rule is mayim einam tmeim ela im kain hem al yadav b'shas netilas yadayim l'tzorach netilas yadayim. If you're using less than a revius, the only way the water can become impure on your hands and therefore needs to be washed away, needs to be rinsed away, is if the water came on your hands during Netilas Yadayim for the purpose of Netilas Yadayim. But mi shelo natal yadav v'naga b'mayim, someone whose hands were wet for any other reason other than as a result of netilas yadayim, nifsalu otam mayim l'netila, those water, that water is not disqualified. Not disqualified. That's not called impure water. Aval asur lirchotz yadav b'mayim shenatal b'hem chaveiro kvar. But you cannot reuse water from netilas yadayim. That cannot be reused. Now, let's understand the implications of this. If you wash your hands with soap and water before eating, and then want to do netilas yadayim, the water which is left on your hands from washing with soap and water, that water did not come onto your hands as part of netilas yadayim, and therefore that water is pure and does not have to be dried off. Before continuing, I'm going to see what the problems of my grandchildren are. So okay, grandchildren taken care of. Um, the the idea that first washing, if your hands are wet before you begin the process of netilas yadayim, typically because you washed with soap and water, it's not only the Shulchan Aruch, but even the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal HaTanya, also agrees. Kol tumas hamayim me'al yadayim eina ela b'mayim she'al hayad b'shas netila. Hands being wet for any other reason, most typically because you washed your hands before netilas yadayim, that water is irrelevant, and there's no reason to dry your hands between washing your hands with soap and water and then doing netilas yadayim. The Shulchan Aruch Harav agrees with that, and therefore that's also very common, the common opinion amongst Hasidic poskim. Further, Misha Natal Yadav Kedin, Hen Tahorot, V'achakach Nagav B'mayim Tameim. If your hands are pure because you did proper netilas yadayim, and now on the way to the table to make hamotzi, someone walks into the house and you quickly shake their hands, and their hands were wet for whatever reason, and now your hands have become wet again between netilas yadayim and hamotzi and eating the bread. Well, now your hands did not get that, they did not become wet through the process of netilas yadayim. They became wet because you shook the hands of someone who just walked in from the rain and their hands were wet. Your hands got wet because someone handed you something that was wet, and now your hands got wet. It doesn't matter how your hands got wet between netilas yadayim and hamotzi. That water is tahor. Avram, David Varman was his name, from Buchach. Buchach today is in Romania. One of the great Hasidic poskim, he agrees with this as well. Let's see how the Mishnah Brura deals with this. Revius b'basachat osel k'mikveh d'me'ateres. A single revius of water on the hand is as good as a mikveh, and nothing is better than that. Well, Mayim chayim, a natural spring might be better. V'gam hamayim taharim, the water, with the revius of water, your hands are purified. Everything is pure. The water is pure. Your hands are pure. Everything is fine. Therefore, eno tzarich l'mayim shnim. Even the Mishnah Brura agrees that this whole business of a second washing in order to rinse off the first water is only if you are using less than a revius. Kishahaya al yado lichluch, and if your hands were dirty, well, of course you have to do something to wash your hands before Netilas Yadaim. Well, that's not really part of Netilas Yadayim. That's just preparing the hands so that the water will touch your skin. And then there is this other opinion of the Rosh Mishans. There is this other opinion of the Chazon Ish, according to which two pourings are always required, as the Mishnah Brura himself recommended lechatchila. There is that opinion. And the Chayodim said, Yesh linhog kein litol revius al kol yad gam shniyim. The Chayodim and other poskim concur with this, that since Chazal and all the Rishonim talk about two rinses, l'chatchila, that is what you should do. But me'ikar hadin, as long as you use a revius, all is well. To summarize all of this, we're going to look at the sefer written by Rav Binyamin Zilber. Rav Binyamin Zilber was one of the great Talmidim of the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish used to call him Binyamin HaTzadik. And he wrote this sefer, and one of the many things I regret in my life is that when he was a teacher of mine, I was not sufficiently brazen, I was not sufficiently brave to ask him how to pronounce the name of his sefer. I do not know to this very day whether it's Beit Baruch, house of the blessed, or Bayit Baruch, the blessed house. Well, if I had been more brave in the days when I was a Talmud of his, I could have asked him. In any event, he says, and this is the summary which is most widely accepted, Tiknu chachamim shetzarich litol mayim ala yad pa'amayim. Chazal said twice. V'zen nikra mayim rishonim u'shnim. That's called two times. First time purifies the hands, second time rinses the water off. But if you use a revius, that's as good as a mikveh, and you don't need anything else. Yesh cholkim, some people disagree and think you should always wash twice. And people who do that, that's tov. It's tov. And there's some distance between what is tov and what is required, but it is tov to follow the practice of two pourings. Now everything can be summarized as follows. If you use a revius, you're done. And there's no reason to be concerned with the second pour at all, even though the Mishnah Brura seemed to imply that one should always rinse twice. Further, everyone agrees that if you wash your hands with a full revius, then it's obvious that there's no need to remove the second water from your hands because that's entirely pure. What we see then is that nowadays, when almost everyone is using much more than a revius of water every time they pour, that by itself is sufficient if your hands were clean before you started. Washing twice is commendable, is tov, very good, strongly advised. 3 times would be required only if your hands were dirty to start with. Now, everything we've said to this point is rooted in the opinions of the poskim. The Kabbalists have a slightly different approach. The Kaf HaChaim, Rav Sofer was his name, wrote as follows. L'divrei Arizal, according to the great Kabbalist of Tzat, tzarich shalosh pamim, you always need three, according to the Kabbalists. Af benosein revius b'asachas, even though you're using a lot of water or revius, in the poskim told us you don't need more than a revius, but still, al pi Kabbalah, you still need three pourings. V'chein matabil, and if you're immersing your hands in a mikveh, in the lake, in the ocean, you need three times to immerse the hands. Kadesha tavo alehem kavanah, in order to have the proper kavanas. And if you want to have the proper Kabbalistic kavanas, well, I've given them to you on the screen, and you have them on the source sheet, which you should have received by email. And if you wish to follow the Kabbalistic path, these are the kavanot, these are the ideas you should have in mind for the first washing, the second washing, and the third washing. We have to also talk about Rav Shmelka. One of the great Hasidic rabbis, Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg, he was very, very frum. He had 300 strict practices with when he washed his hands. He had in mind 300 chumrot above and beyond what is required by halacha. One of them was not to use mayim shesha'avu akum. If the maid who drew the water from the well was not Jewish, if the maid who went down to the river to get the water was not Jewish, if the person who supplied the water was not Jewish, he was mahmir, and he would not use that water for Netilas Yadaim. He insisted that the water be supplied by a Jewish person. It seems to me that this chumrah is probably connected with what it says in the Shulchan Aruch, Lo yitol memi shelo natal yadav shacharit. When you wake up in the morning and you're going to wash your hands, well, as with every other washing, you don't have to do it yourself. Someone else can pour the water on your hands. The requirement is that the water come onto your hands by human agency, not that they just fall onto your hands. It's insufficient just to put your hands under running water, because the water did not come onto your hands, the koach gavra, through human agency. When you wake up in the morning, the person, if someone is going to pour the water on your hands, that person must in turn have done Netilas Yadayim first. And that's therefore a Jewish person, and I propose this as the source of Rav Shmelka's practice. Now we come to minimizing the amount of water. What happens if you're hiking? What happens if you find yourself in a situation where you just don't have a lot of water? Well, we know that you need a revius. And what the Shulchan Aruch says is one person washing hands by himself or by herself needs a revius. If two people are going to wash their hands together because they don't have much water to spare, ha'acharon eino tzarich, the second person does not need a revius. Afilu b'zeh achazeh, even though they're not washing their hands simultaneously. Bilvad shelo yafsik hakiluach, as long as the flowing of the water did not stop, the second person does not need a revius. Ketzad, how are you supposed to do it? And these are the words of the Shulchan Aruch. Haya revius mayim bekli. You have a small cup of water, very small cup of water, holding only a revius. Pashat echad yadav. One person sticks out his hands. One person sticks out her hands. V'acher yotzei kal yadav. And the second person pours from the cup onto the person's hands. Then, bahasheni, now the person who was pouring quickly puts down the cup and takes his hands and puts them under the first person's hands. Lamata. Kiluach yured al yadav. The water now drips from the first person's hands onto the second person's hands. And even though there's not a revius of water left, because we started with a revius and not all of it is going to drip onto the second person's hands, nonetheless, since we started with a revius, both persons' hands are pure. It follows, therefore, that if you have 5 or 6 or any number of people, and they all stand with their hands stacked up, not touching, but close to each other, pour a revius water on the top, as long as the water drips down to all the hands, even though by the time you get to the second or third person, it's not going to be much water on their hands at all, as long as some water reaches all of their hands, all is well, and they've all performed Netilas Yadaim, and then they can all eat bread. I'm going to pause at this time, and what I want to speak about next week is Netilas Yadayim for Ruach Ra, for spiritual matters. That'll be a separate topic. At this point, let me ask you if you have any questions that you want to pose. We're okay?
Good.
And we'll pause at this point. I wish you a good week, a safe week. A question from Jody, yes.
One is he had 300 practices on Netilat Yadaim. Are they listed?
No. It is just said that he had 300 chumrot, and this was one of them.
Oh, they were chumras. So is there any idea what they all were?
I personally could not begin to make a list 300 long. No.
Okay, thank you. I have an unrelated question, please.
Yeah, yes.
Concerning lace top shatels.
Awesome.
Oh, I won't ask the question then.
No, are you talking about the shaitels are hair with an underlying layer of cloth? It's the underlying layer of cloth, which is since the hair, which is attached to the top of the lace, is going to cover the whole. Bottom line, since the hair of the woman is not visible, it doesn't matter how this is achieved.
So halachically, they're not an issue. Any shaitel is not an issue as long as the woman's hair is covered.
You got it.
Whether they would be accepted in a community, would that be an issue of minhag makom, or that's could not even be within that purview?
When the Chazani, when the Chatam Sofer came originally from Frankfurt in Germany, he had rabbinic positions in a few small towns in Hungary, and then he got his big position as the chief rabbi of Pressburg, Bratislava, it's called today, and that was his first job, his first position as one of the major rabbanim of Europe. He arrived in the town of Pressburg to take over the rabbinut there, and the first morning after davening Shacharis, a mishlachet, a delegation of important members of the community, approached this young rabbi, this new rabbi, with an ultimatum. And the Balabatim said to this new young rabbi, previously, you were the Rav of small villages in Hungary. Now you are the Rav of a large commercial center. You must realize, young rabbi, that we engage here in international commerce, and our wives are very much involved in our businesses. Don't get the idea in your head that you are going to prohibit shaitels and insist on kerchiefs for the head. Well, it took him around half an hour to declare that from then on, shaitels are prohibited in Pressburg, and only kerchiefs are permitted. And he was quite successful, incidentally, in ramming this chumrah, this strict position, ramming it through. And indeed, in Pressburg, as in all those smaller villages that he had been the rabbi before, the women wore only kerchiefs and not shaitlach. And therefore, if there is then there were such places. Today, I know of no such place. But if there is a place where all the women are covering their head with kerchiefs and not shaitlach, then in that place it will be minhag hamokum, and even a visitor would have to conform. But I don't think there are such places anymore.
Right.
Not that
And
I know of.
so if a community, well, as you say, like I haven't seen one, not that I've seen that many, but so people use shaitlach, then it wouldn't be an issue of like, you can wear shaitel but not a lace top shaitel.
You can wear shaitel, but not.
You can wear a shaitel, not a lace top shaitel, if one can tell the difference, which expert women.
Well, no. This is no. There's no basis for this. And as you remember quite well, a few years ago, there's a flurry of excitement about shaitlach coming from idolatrous temples in India or something like that. Well, these things come up from time to time, but one should try to ignore them.
Thank you.
Okay. Incidentally, is the lace shaitel lighter and more airy and cooler?
Yeah, much more comfortable.
That's the whole purpose of it. Okay.
And they look even more real.
It looks better. It looks more real. Okay,
more
fine.
The
It's okay.
Thanks
Okay, be well.
so much. You too. Bye. Have a good week.
Shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye.